Today's webinar is a bit different. We are hosting 3 webinars to discuss the new book, Contain and Eliminate, which details the landmark Wilk v. AMA lawsuit in the 1970s and 80s. Now, you may think hearing a discussion about decades-old lawsuits sounds pretty dry, but I can assure you that's not the case. This story is fascinating. Break-ins, spy versus spy, counter-spies, witnesses disappearing in the dark of night, and even Scientology. This story has it all. Today's webinar is the first in the series, followed by part 2 on Thursday, January 7th, and a live Q&A with our panelists on Tuesday, January 12th. The webinars are being recorded and will be posted on NCMIC following the broadcast. When we began to plan for these webinars, we thought it would be best to hear the stories from those with firsthand knowledge of the events surrounding the Wilk v. AMA case. Joining us on the webinars are 3 people with intimate knowledge of the case. First, we have Howard Walensky, who wrote Contain and Eliminate. Howard was a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times and covered the trial. George McAndrews was the attorney who tried the case on behalf of the plaintiff chiropractors, and Dr. Lou Sportelli, a leader in the chiropractic profession for decades. Our conversations with Mr. Walensky, Mr. McAndrews, and Dr. Sportelli were pre-recorded for the webinar today and the second program on Thursday. The Q&A webinar next Tuesday will be live, so our listeners will have the opportunity to pose questions to our panelists. Why is this important? The Wilk v. AMA case was a hard-fought battle, the consequences of which are felt by every chiropractor practicing today. It kicked open doors long shut to chiropractors. It demolished barriers to practice and lessened old stigmas and perceptions about the profession. Plus, it's an amazing story of persistence and perseverance amongst some real cloak and dagger spy novel intrigue. I'm going to help listeners understand the timeline of events and provide clarification when needed through narration. We begin with Dr. Sportelli discussing events leading up to the Wilk v. AMA trial.
It's like trying to take your 21-year-old to the World Trade Center in New York and have them understand that there were 2 incredible towers there that were destroyed. 9/11 doesn't mean anything to the 21-year-old. What we're talking about today doesn't mean a lot to the practitioners born 20 years ago, because they weren't even born yet. The roads have been paved with macadam and concrete for them to have smooth sailing into the VA, the DOD, into hospitals, into integrated practices.
I had 4 brothers, Jack, Jerry, Tom, and Dave. We were all 2 years apart. And every one of us at one period of time was asked by my father to go with him after midnight to a farmer's home or a suburban home and to sleep in the car while he went in and adjusted the patient or the family. When we inquire, this is a strange way to take care of your patients. He said, well, if they came to my office and word got back to their medical doctor that they were seeing a chiropractor, the medical doctor would no longer take care of them. We understood the actions. We weren't thinking about how devastating they were. My hostility toward the medical profession didn't start with this case. It started when I was very young and heard the insults directed at my father or communicated to my father by the patients that came to him, and the hiding out in the fields and the yards at 1 a.m.
The Contain and Eliminate title came from the fact that the AMA used those specific words in their memorandum, that their mission on this Committee on Quackery was first to contain and then to eliminate the profession of chiropractic. Those 2 words came directly from that document. I graduated from Palmer College in 1962, and the Committee on Quackery was formed in 1963. I opened up in a little community, and there were 4 corners on a main road in town. I rented a small office on one of the corners. Directly across the street from me was the town medical physician. Directly across the street from both of us was the funeral home. The medical physician refused to treat my landlord because he had rented his office to a quack. Every patient that walked into that medical physician's office, he would say, if you go over there to that guy, you're going to wind up across the street. Well, across the street was a funeral home called Schneider. So you'll wind up at Schneider's if you go to the chiropractor. I had no idea. I was obviously in a community with a bunch of buttheads who basically were refusing to do anything for me in terms of lab work. We had a little community hospital. I sent my patients up there for blood work. They refused to do blood work on my patients. They refused to do urinalysis on my patients. One of the cases was a cardiac case. I sent them to the cardiologist. They refused to take my patient. So you couldn't even get a referral in my own community. I live about 25 miles from Allentown, which is a larger community with two rather large healthcare facilities. I had my attorney and another friend of mine introduce me to some friends of theirs. One was a gastroenterologist and one was a neurologist. They introduced me as a chiropractor. As a result of that, those two physicians accepted my patients and sent them back with a note. The ones I did not know, it wasn't a referral, it was a transferal because you never got the patient back and the patient became scared. A lot of the patients in my community were afraid to tell their family physician that they were going to the chiropractor because they were afraid that their family physician was not going to take care of them anymore. That was the stigma, the social ostracization that you had as a chiropractor back in those days, and you didn't even know it. Of course, back then, we didn't have to worry about reimbursement because it was a 100% cash practice because no insurance company would pay for chiropractic. People that came to you came because they wanted to, or they had heard something good about the fact that chiropractors could help them. And so they came, paid for it out of their own pocket, but always under the pressure of, is my family physician going to be angry? One of the questions I finally developed on my chiropractic intake form was, can I communicate with your family physician? Can I send them a report? I needed approval to do that. That question alone would tell me whether I had a solid patient or a concerned patient or an afraid patient. If they checked no, I would ask them why. And then they'd finally reveal to me that their family doctor thinks that I'm a quack and I shouldn't come here.
This Contain and Eliminate plan originated in Iowa. Chiropractors were a relatively huge element in the medical world in the 60s in Iowa. There was a weight ratio of one chiropractor for every 4 MDs. Those MDs could feel the chiropractors breathing on their necks, they were breathing on their backs, they were breathing. Very successful in Iowa, which is where it all started. Doyle Taylor was the night city editor for the Des Moines Register. His brother was the executive director of the Iowa State Medical Society. Robert Throckmorton was an attorney. Strangely, in his obit, it listed the fact that during World War II, he was the legal architect of the relocation camps for the Japanese. In other words, he helped develop the plan to contain Japanese Americans in World War II. He's the guy who came up with the idea to contain and eliminate. What is that? Well, the idea was to try to stop the chiropractors anywhere where the chiropractors were trying to improve their profession. Chiropractors wanted funding from the federal government. They were taxpayers. And they wanted funding for scholarships and so on for students at chiropractic schools. They wanted funding for research on chiropractic. The MDs would criticize the chiropractors. You don't have any research. Well, they were also trying to stop them from having research. Anywhere the chiropractors went, eventually the chiropractors got some Medicare coverage. And notice the AMA tried to stop them.
In 1963, the AMA created the Committee on Quackery. In 1964, H. Doyle Taylor was appointed director of AMA Department of Investigation and organized the Committee on Quackery.
So anywhere chiropractic is trying to improve its lot, Robert Throckmorton was trying to stop them in Iowa. There was a big meeting up in Minneapolis where a lot of the Midwestern MD societies got together. Throckmorton gave a speech on what he was doing in Iowa. As it happens, the AMA was represented at that meeting. They hired him. Remember, he was working for the brother of Doyle Taylor. Doyle Taylor not only was the city editor of the Des Moines Register, but he also was an attorney. He was hired by Throckmorton to run a national program like the Iowa program to try to contain and eliminate chiropractic. Throckmorton eventually falls out of the picture, but for almost 10 years, Taylor was the executive in charge of a bigger organization that was public called the Department of Investigations. They looked into psychic surgeons and all these things, very flashy things. And a subsidiary of that was the Office on Quackery. And that's where Doyle Taylor came in.
That was the birthplace of the Committee on Quackery at the AMA, because Throckmorton left his position as the head of the Iowa Medical Society, and he was hired as the general counsel of the AMA, and he established the Committee on Quackery for the entire country, because the AMA, when they heard what Iowa was doing, that had the highest proportion of chiropractors to MDs, they decided that Throckmorton would be the one to set up the Committee on Quackery at the AMA. He brought along Doyle Taylor.
The AMA had a two-pronged approach to the destruction of chiropractic. One was internal. Let's make sure that every medical physician of every specialty thinks chiropractors are quacks. And if we did a word association among the medical community and you mentioned the word chiropractor, the second word association would ultimately be quackery. It was quacks. Chiropractors were uneducated quacks. The uneducated part was kind of interesting in that the AMA did a very, very clever situation. First of all, let's call the chiropractors totally uneducated. And then the colleges and schools that were seeking accreditation were trying to employ medical physicians and PhDs in biochemistry and so forth and so on. Well, anybody who was going to teach at a chiropractic institution received a letter or a phone call saying, if you teach at a chiropractic institution, you'll never teach again. So you called me uneducated on one hand and then prevent people who could teach from teaching at those institutions.
This was a trigger for the AMA. We'll make it unethical for them to deal with them, and we'll suggest that there'll be penalties for acting unethically if they directly or indirectly work with a chiropractor.
The second half, which was equally as dangerous, and unfortunately the profession hadn't focused on it for a long time, is back then, of course, the syndicated columnists like Ann Landers were read by the millions and syndicated in almost every newspaper. Well, the AMA got to Ann Landers and gave her a trip to China. She wrote a negative article on chiropractic, which they then reprinted and made sure everybody read. Then the magazine of choice in every kind of doctor's office was Reader's Digest. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you couldn't go to a physician's reception room that you wouldn't find a Reader's Digest. They were from, 1960s, but the bottom line is they had a shelf life that was as good as Twinkie forever.
I can attest to how widespread Reader's Digest was. It was mandatory bathroom reading in both my grandparents' homes in the 70s.
The Reader's Digest published a devastating article, Should Chiropractors Be Paid with Your Tax Dollars? Now, why was that so important? They already poisoned the well of the legislatures that they should never fund chiropractic and Medicare, but they also poisoned the minds of the public by saying that this was a frivolous situation that never should have happened. So if the value of Medicare shouldn't pay chiropractic, why should I go as a consumer? That was one of the major publications at the time. The second one that was held in extremely high esteem was Consumer's Report. Consumer's Report in September and October 73 or 4 published a two-part series. Chiropractors, healers or quacks. At that time, and Consumer's Report was a phenomenally popular and well-established publication, harmed irreparably the image of chiropractic. They wanted to reinforce to the legislature and to their membership, let's not let our guard down. So you poison the well of the public image. We had a well-known sociologist at the time, Walter Worden, who labeled chiropractors marginal and deviant. It received press in a disproportionate amount of publicity. Why? Because the AMA was behind anything that was negative to chiropractic. It got enormous press. When you think about those terms, quackery, marginal, deviant, all of those kinds of things form an image, and the image then becomes subliminal. And anytime the word is mentioned, they think they've studied this in a proper analytical fashion, when all they have done is draw upon their subconscious, already prejudicial mindset. That's what happened to us for decades. We couldn't erase the stigma of the negative image of chiropractic.
The AMA didn't pass up any opportunity to provide information that was hostile to chiropractic anytime they saw that the chiropractors were becoming publicized. Hundreds of times that Committee on Quackery would get a request for information, and they would send it to their state associations. They would send it to the unions. Then they would spread the information that chiropractors were damning. They knew that the problem that chiropractors were handling was successful. They knew that the chiropractors were making money. The insurance companies told them that many of the insurance dollars that went out, although there were fewer claims by the medical doctors, the chiropractors got a substantial amount of money from things like insurance for tractor back. Just imagine sitting on a tractor before they'd come up with all of these modern inventions like you see on bicycles and motorcycles that soften the blow. These farmers would go out and spend 10 hours a day in a tractor, popping up and down, not on a smooth highway, but on a plowed bit of ground, pulling up weeds and planting seeds. There was little they could do. They'd go to the MD, and the MD would say, well, here's some aspirin. And I'm exaggerating now, but that's what they would do. They'd give them a painkiller. By the time they were 2 days back on the tractor, they'd say, whatever the MD's give me isn't helping, but we can go to the chiropractor, and the chiropractor will move the bones in the spine, and it get very much relief. My dad had probably 25 to 50 farmers. My memory of my father's practice, my memory of my uncle's practice, and my memory of my brothers and sisters' practices, and of my cousins' practices, all chiropractors. And the other 3 chiropractors in Clinton all had these farmers come to him because they'd say he can't get any relief at all from the medical doctor.
The AMA led a war against the idea of Medicare. Let's keep government out of the examining room. They were worried about socialized medicine. Things didn't unfold the way they portrayed them, but the AMA started to lose membership. They lost power because the Medicare law was passed. The AMA needed to rally the boys and later the girls around the flag of the AMA. The way they did that was trying to destroy the chiropractors, and they tried to destroy them with this secret organization known as the Committee on Quackery. So much in life can be serendipity and luck. We just fall into these things. I think that's the theme here. In 1950, a science fiction writer known as L. Ron Hubbard came out with a book called Dianetics, which is widely known whether you're a Scientologist or not. L. Ron Hubbard expected that the medical doctors and the psychiatrists were going to hail him as the champion who cured mental illness. The AMA had a different opinion. In 1951, the AMA journal published a letter to the editor from a medical doctor who made fun of Scientology and Dianetics, compared them to the chiropractors, and basically called them both cults based on religion, not based on science. Hubbard was upset, and he kept an enemies list.
In 1966, AMA declared it unethical for MDs to associate professionally with chiropractors. That's the same year the IRS rescinded Scientology's nonprofit status. In 1967, L. Ron Hubbard issued the Fair Game Directive to protect Scientology at all costs.
They tried to get his 501c3 taken away, get his church designation taken away. Well, this guy must have been some kind of interesting character because he had his own CIA. He basically infiltrated the AMA. He had an operation that was pretty impressive in terms of having his own, what they called the Guardian Office, which would be the equivalent of the CIA. They investigated and went after anybody that was anti-Scientology.
Scientology infiltrated the AMA, and that's when they discovered this policy of the AMA and this organization within the AMA to try to contain and eliminate chiropractic and to not show the AMA hand. They published a book called In the Public Interest. Nobody read it, but it contained all these actual memos and letters and documents from the AMA. Nobody paid attention except for this guy named Chester Wilk. Jerry McAndrews had bought rights to distribute the book.
We became aware of the existence of the Committee on Quackery when Into Public Interest was published, because the copy of the internal memorandum of the establishment of that committee and their goals was published. So we knew that a committee was formed, and we knew that it was established, and we knew that there was clandestine activity. And after a time, they couldn't find anything that the AMA was doing anti-Scientology, but they discovered all of this chiropractic stuff. If I were L. Ron Hubbard, I would basically say, look, they don't have anything against us, but why waste a good crisis? Let's give it to the chiropractors and see what they'll do with it. If they can harm my enemy, then they're going to be my friend. Scientologists gave us a gift, because we would have never in a million years been able to discover those particular documents. Scientology did not want their hand to show in the chiropractic approach to the AMA any more than the AMA wanted their invisible hand to show in the anti-chiropractic situation.
There had been rumors in chiropractic circles almost from the beginning that there was a conspiracy to destroy them. Dating back to the 20s and the 30s and going forward, there were these rumors. Chester Wilk actually got his hands on documents that came from a secret source. These documents proved that there indeed was a conspiracy.
In 1973, AMA introduced Standard X, designed to keep chiropractors out of JCAH-accredited facilities. In 1973, the Scientology Guardian's Office launched Snow White, a program to spy on government agencies as well as organizations such as the AMA.
Somebody infiltrated not only the AMA, but 30 other organizations, including the CIA, IRS, the Justice Department. The Scientologists were bold. They bugged the offices of the General Counsel of the IRS, the AMA's for-profit organization. So the Scientologists planted a secretary there and planted 2 secretaries in the lobbying office in Washington. So they got more documents. What was clear was Scientology was barely on the AMA's radar, but clearly chiropractic was. Scientologists didn't have anything against the chiropractors. In fact, a certain segment of the chiropractic population were Scientologists. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, had a personal chiropractor because he had a bad back. So they didn't have anything against chiropractic, but they were not above using this plot against chiropractic to their own advantage.
In 1975, several things transpired. Sore Throat reached out to the media, congressional offices, and federal regulators with purloined AMA documents, and 4 government investigations launched against the AMA. The AMA laid off 75 employees, including H. Doyle Taylor, in what was known as the May Day Massacre. And the Federal Trade Commission received AMA documents showing an economic boycott of chiropractic from the anonymous source Sore Throat.
They had this other philosophy called fair play, which meant they would stop at nothing to attack the opponents of Scientology. There was a character known in the media in mid-70s, 1975. He was known as Sore Throat. Now, what I've discovered is a lot of people are unaware of who Deep Throat was. Deep Throat was the number 2 person at the FBI who leaked documents to the Washington Post that led to the fall of President Nixon. And of course, the reference there was to a pornographic film that was made back in the 70s somewhere. So it was sort of a joke at the Washington Post. We went from Deep Throat to Sore Throat. And Sore Throat claimed to be a whistleblower who had worked for the AMA and was fired in what was called the Friday Night Massacre, or maybe it was Monday night, but it was definitely called a massacre because they laid off about 80 people.
It was actually the Saturday Night Massacre for history buffs out there.
This person claimed to be a physician, and so there was all this guessing at the AMA. Who is this Sore Throat? Because Sore Throat went to the media and got a lot of publicity, and nobody seemed to be asking the question, who is Sore Throat? Because the AMA authenticated these memos that talked about the destruction of chiropractic.
One of them was Sore Throat, and he let out the word that he was a disgruntled medical doctor. This is after he had pilfered Hartford probably 10,000 documents looking for what they had done against Scientology. He later testified that the amazing thing was it wasn't Scientology that was the target. The real target was the chiropractors. Chiropractors were growing by leaps and bounds compared to the Scientologists. So they collected every document. They went to the AMA outside lawyers' offices and even took the lawyers' documents out. They did it gently by going in and getting jobs as secretaries or paralegals, and they did that across the board.
Until the early 70s, when Sore Throat landed documents on the desks and in the mail to a number of chiropractors and a number of organizations. Prior to that, there was a book called In the Public Interest, but it was just a book. Where was the validation or the verification for all of those documents? We knew they were true. We just had to prove it. Scientology did not want their hand to show in the chiropractic approach to the AMA any more than the AMA wanted their invisible hand to show in the anti-chiropractic situation. So what did they do? They fabricated this story that Sore Throat, he was dubbed Sore Throat, of course, after the Watergate situation. Sore Throat suggested to those that he spoke with. And by the way, he did contact press, contacted the Federal Trade Commission, he contacted a number of chiropractors, angry at the fact that the documents they had sent to us, the chiropractors were doing nothing about. So he was really kind of angry. He basically used the guise, if you will, that I'm an ethical, disgruntled medical physician, which was a believable story. I mean, there's no question about the fact that somebody would think that somebody in the AMA might have a conscience. I mean, they weren't all surgically removed. The profession was not quick to act, primarily because, for example, the attorney for the ACA cautioned against any kind of activity. When we went to the Federal Trade Commission, they wouldn't hear it, and nobody else was picking up the ball. Sore Throat was angry. When he contacted a number of us, Peter Flom, myself, Jerry McAndrews, when Sore Throat finally called, he used a voice synthesizer, suggesting to us that the AMA would know his voice and he would immediately be identified. Of course, as we find out after the fact, that the AMA didn't know him from Adam because it wasn't him. And that was it actually infiltrated the AMA. It was the secretaries who did a phenomenal job. Got him to call into Parker Seminar. He did not want to be recorded. I promised him that I would record him only because I wanted to make sure that we had the printed transcripts that we could then utilize to distribute and get more activity and energy and enthusiasm and funding for the lawsuit. He agreed. I did, in fact, destroy the tape, and I had the tape transcribed. He talked at Parker. He talked at another group. He basically made a few public appearances vis-a-vis telephone and voice synthesizer and all of the cloak and dagger stuff that one would suspect one would use. He was angrier, frankly, than a lot of chiropractors were at the lack of activity.
So they collected every document. They went to the AMA outside lawyers' offices and even took the lawyers' documents out. They did it gently by going in and getting jobs as secretaries or paralegals. He contacted Sportelli and my brother Jerry, and he gave all these altruistic statements that he was doing something against his profession as a medical doctor. He wasn't a medical doctor. He was just an employee, but he supplied them with documents. In fact, I think he supplied them with a book that had been written about the AMA's program against chiropractic. He said it was 10 to 12 times as harsh as anything that the AMA had done against Scientologists. They delivered about 1,500 documents to my office. And they said, here are some documents that we've gotten from somebody who works for the AMA. When I went through them, I was inflamed. You remember my background. My dad, everybody was a chiropractor. I saw the documents and I just thought, my golly, this is something. And my brother Jerry went around to the chiropractic colleges and showed them the documents.
The memos were talking about how the AMA was cheating on its not-for-profit status. It turned out that the AMA owned $20 million in back taxes. The AMA was messing around with various congressmen, giving them money. Sore Throat said, I'm a good citizen and I got laid off by the AMA, so I'm going to blow the whistle. The media picked up on it, the government picked up on it, and some pretty powerful government organizations, the Justice Department, the IRS, and believe it or not, the U.S. Postal Service, because the AMA had been lying about its circulation figures, trying to get a better rate, a big source of revenue for the AMA. This is the Journal of the AMA and a number of other journals. Sore Throat was kind of a clever guy, and he starts to leak material and out of the blue calls Chester Wilk. He tells Chester, look at these news clippings. There's hundreds of clippings here. I've been blowing the whistle on the AMA. Watch your mail. You're going to get some documents and you're going to get a collect phone call from me. If you're smart, you'll accept it. Chester, for the previous year and a half, without much success, was trying to raise money for an antitrust suit to prove that the AMA was indulging in a conspiracy. So he about jumped for joy when he heard from Sore Throat. Chiropractic basically had been blowing off Chester Wilk, and Sore Throat, before he went to Wilk, went to the American Chiropractic Association and got no satisfaction, to quote a famous song. He was blown off by the general counsel for the American Chiropractic Association. In the original Watergate story with Deep Throat, it was a rent-a-cop in the Watergate Hotel who caught him. In this case, it was a suspicious library in the library of the District of Columbia Bar Association. He saw these guys and he was a little bit nervous about them. He called the FBI and he had good reason. They were using his library as the base of operation to break into the Justice Department through a back door. During daytime hours, they got in there, they got a key, made a copy, returned, and they were able to get in and copy documents. Eventually, they get stopped by FBI agents, but they're sweet talkers and they got out of it. One hid out with Scientology for a year with the FBI in pursuit. He started to figure out they were going to roll over on him, and they were going to make him take the fall for L. Ron Hubbard and his wife, Mary Sue, who was the head of the spy and dirty trick organization within Scientology that was known as the Guardian's Office. He beats him to the punch, and he calls the Justice Department and ends up surrendering in a bowling alley in Los Angeles, and they have him plead guilty. He knows where everything is inside the organization, and the FBI ends up conducting the biggest raid in FBI history. They use garbage trucks to haul away all of the documents. In the end, 10 Scientologists went to jail, including Mrs. Hubbard. The funny thing is, chiropractic was a winner in this whole thing because eventually they got the lawsuit. And the lawsuit changed things for chiropractic, a lot of things. It might have happened anyway, but the Wilk case was decided and the conspiracy was declared.
George McAndrews became the attorney in this case by default, by guilt. It's a legal tactic that they use that if you're on retainer, you can't take a case. The AMA basically did the same thing back in the 60s and 70s. They had the best law firms on retainer. When we went to try to find a lawyer to take on this case, first of all, some of the lawyers thought we were out of our minds to basically file action against the AMA, but many of the other ones couldn't take the case anyway. They were on retainer.
George called the eight largest law firms in Chicago. None of them would take the case of the chiropractors versus organized medicine. They considered chiropractors beneath consideration. They wanted to get business from medical associations like the AMA. Chicago was a headquarters for a lot of these groups. They wanted to get the drug companies. No way are they going to take the chiropractors as a client.
Jerry McAndrews went to his brother and appealed on the guilt of his father. George's father was a chiropractor, chiropractor who suffered the same indignities in his little town in Clinton, Iowa, that chiropractors were facing all over the country. He had to practice in the middle of the night. George realized that his father was affected by it. And so Jerry pulled the guilt card.
George was reluctant. He didn't practice antitrust law per se. He practiced patent law. He was a litigator. He had that going for him. He said, no, I don't think I want to take this case. Jerry said, our dad was a chiropractor. If you don't take this case, he's going to kick the lid off his coffin and haunt you forever. That's how George McAndrews came to be involved and to represent the chiropractors. They were lucky. I mentioned serendipity earlier. They probably couldn't have found a better lawyer for the job, although admittedly, a lot of the chiropractors were resistant to hiring George. They thought it was patronage since Jerry McAndrews was prominent. So, should we be hiring his brother? Well, it turned out to be probably the best thing they could have done because this was a long road for everybody involved.
We'll stop there for today. Spies, counter-spies, witness protection, and Scientology are pretty exciting, but be sure to join us for episode 2 coming Thursday at 2 p.m. Central Time when we will get into the Wilk v. AMA trial and its aftermath. Documents are missing, a key witness disappears, and a judge gets downright riled up. You don't want to miss this. Before we go, a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available at ncmic.com. All registered attendees will automatically receive a recording via email. I'd also like to remind you of our resources section on ncmic.com. We're continually adding to our content with information to help you navigate daily practice and deal with challenges that you face. We have information out there on a wide variety of topics, including COVID issues and risk management, so please check that out. You can also keep up to date on new resources from NCMIC by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'd also like to remind you of our new podcast, Chiropractical. We have a new episode out and available, so remember you can download episodes of Chiropractical at ncmic.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to part 2 of our webinar series coming this Thursday. I hope you'll be able to join us.